it's better if people kind of find their way to the podcast and then they become the people that spread the word about the show. So, I mean, that's a slow process, like building word of mouth and stuff, but it's way more effective.
That was Drew Ackerman, and this is Podcast Ninja.
Podcast Ninja.
What's going on, ninjas? I'm your host, Anthony, and this is Podcast Ninja, a show that interviews the most successful podcasters in the game. And my goal is simply to uncover the best podcasting strategies that you can apply to your show. In today's episode, we have Drew Ackerman, who is the host of Sleep With Me podcast. Now, if you want to learn how Drew turned his passion into a successful podcast that now reaches millions around the world, this is going to be the perfect episode for you. We're going to be talking about how you can grow your audience, engaging with your listeners, and profitably monetizing your show. Let's get into the show. All right, man. So I think it would be cool to start off by, for those that don't know what the name of your podcast is and what it is all about.
Okay, I'm Drew Ackerman. I make a podcast called Sleep With Me. It's kind of like bedtime stories for adults, and it's always like a interesting first pitch, but it's like for people that can't sleep, it's not that different than the bedtime stories your parents would read you as a kid, or you might tell your siblings. And it's just kind of meandering stories that you can kind of engage in, that kind of get your attention, but are boring enough and have enough twists and turns that you kind of are like, oh, wait, I don't have to listen to this. I can kind of slowly tune it out and fall asleep.
So, okay, so is this was this your life dream to sort of have a podcast that helps people fall asleep, or what inspired you, to get into this?
Yeah, that's hilarious because, I think, I've never been asked it in that specific way, but I think that's a great question because I think, looking back at it, this would have been never something I would have dreamed about doing or been, aspired to do. But now, when I think about myself as a kid, I'm like, oh, man, this is, exactly, I would have never thought about this, but this is something I would have loved to have been doing. The podcast stems from when I was in grammar school. I started getting insomnia or having trouble sleeping because I had a lot of trouble in school, and I would have trouble getting along with the teachers and getting my schoolwork done. And so every night I'd be worried about the next day at school and what was going to happen. And I couldn't sleep, and there was people were like, oh, well, why don't you just stop thinking about school? And I'm like, well, I can't just turn my brain off. And I would be tossing and turning and worrying. And then at some point, one of my classmates, I think in 5th or 6th grade, was like, oh, there's this radio comedy show on Sunday nights called the Dr. Demento Show, which is like a people would play parody songs and stuff. And I started listening to that. It never put me to sleep. It always took my mind off the fact that I couldn't sleep. And I think those ideas just kind of sat latent in my brain for years and years and years. And then once I started listening to podcasts and realizing what a wide open medium it is, and kind of ripe for experimentation. At some point, I was like, maybe I could do something to help adults fall asleep because there's not really any options out there other than straightforward ones. There's nothing that's kind of silly or goofy or kind of childlike. And so I literally just started experimenting and putting episodes out and developed the show from there.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you say that because I'll be honest, man. I love your show, obviously, but there are times where I had to turn it off because I actually laughed. I laughed a little too much at some of the jokes. It wasn't, and I'm not saying you tell jokes, but sometimes I was like, man, that was so creative or that was funny. And although it's helped me, I never actually gotten through a whole entire podcast. I know you hear that all the time, right? But people think about your show and like, all right, is there a strategy behind it? You help people fall asleep, but does that mean you just, clearly talking to you now comparison to your podcast, you clearly tailored your voice or maybe your storytelling style to be a certain way, I assume.
Yeah, it's very deliberate. And it's it's, I guess, one of the paradoxes of making podcasts is the whole idea of when someone listens to the podcast is that it sounds totally free and easy, but it's a lot of hard work. So it's maintaining a nice pace, maintaining a nice voice, making sure in a weird way I have enough stuff to talk about, or I kind of have like a roadmap, even though like I never am like setting out and reading a script. Like the more structured the kind of story can be, the more space I have to kind of meander and go off topic. So it's like a very deliberate process. And it's also about like some of the benefits of podcasting, that it's in someone's ear and that it's an intimate medium. So you can really like let people feel welcome and go out of your way to address them and make them feel comfortable. And I think those are kind of some of the things that help people fall asleep too.
Yeah, and I don't know if you could speak to it, but as far as like when you first started, you know, most people say when I first started, no one was listening. But the second I heard your show, I was like, I have to listen, right? Was that the case for you? Did anyone listen in the beginning when you first launched?
No, like I had, like, I mean, like, I don't know how many of your listeners, I'm sure a lot of them are either like in the early stages or thinking about starting a podcast. And I had no audience like to bring to the podcast, and I had no listeners when I started the show. So like, literally, I was looking to see if there was like 1 or 2 downloads the first month or two. And then like when it like broke 5 downloads in a day, I was like, holy cow. And I wasn't like, a lot of questions people ask themselves when they're starting a podcast or in the first year or two is like, is anybody listening? I'm not hearing from anyone. I'm asking for feedback. And it was just a case of like going from like 3 or 4 downloads to 5 or 6 downloads to eventually breaking 10 downloads to eventually breaking 30. And just a slow process, and just kind of sticking with it and saying, can I keep making this show better? Like, is there stuff I can change? And then maybe eventually after like around 8 or 9 months, I started to get occasional feedback. And then I was able to kind of be like, oh, this didn't work for this person. Let me try something else and integrate that into the show.
Oh, so you just started launching the show. Did you like share it with friends or family? How'd you kind of like, did you market it anyhow? Or did you just try to tell everyone to go download it? How'd you start spreading the word about your show?
Yeah, like I did not start, like I didn't mention it to family and friends at first, which was kind of funny. Cause I was like worried about, like I knew the show was kind of like an out of the box idea and a little bit strange, and I didn't want to have any not negative feedback, but even like neutral feedback where it's like, you're going to do a podcast to put adults to sleep? Like, that'll be interesting. Like, so I actually just like started putting the episodes out almost like when you put like a note on a telephone pole and be like, well, I don't know if anybody will see this. I don't know if anybody will read this. And, I did try like early on some strategies that have kind of been proven not to work, which is like getting like trying to promote it on Twitter, like in ways like in communities I wasn't a part of or stuff like that. But I quickly realized like that it's better if people kind of find their way to the podcast and then they become the people that spread the word about the show. So I mean, that's a slow process, like building word of mouth and stuff, but it's way more effective. And I mean, the hardest thing is just being patient and keep consistently trying to make your content better.
Yeah, I think so. And it obviously speaks. I kind of did a little digging. I found this article. I know you don't want to talk about downloads, but I read somewhere where it said you had like 1.3 million downloads a month. So, I mean, you're helping millions of people go to sleep at night. That's got to be like fulfilling. You know what I mean? Big difference from when you first started and you felt like nobody was listening. You know what I mean? Yeah.
It's been great. Like, even more so than the numbers, it's like getting the emails and getting the messages of like people that are going through really, really hard times, like being diagnosed with major illnesses or losing a spouse or a close family member and saying like, hey, your podcast helped me get through this really hard time. Or I remember like maybe like a year or so into the podcast, I got an iTunes review of someone that was like, I was listening to your podcast while I was getting treatment in the hospital, and my IV was getting changed every few hours. So every few hours I'd get woken up and I'd put your podcast on to help me get back to sleep. And I mean, you can't, like, that stuff really, it almost tears me up. It's like almost an honor to make the podcast at that point.
That's crazy. Yeah. And I look, you look at your iTunes reviews, man, you have like 2,000, and people don't just say like, Oh, I love the show. Thanks. They literally, you scroll through it and they're telling stories. There's hundreds of comments on Facebook and your about page. I guess, you're constantly engaging and encouraging engagement from your listeners, I suppose. I don't know if you have like a strategy around that. I'm sure you have way too many people to even respond to, right? You can't respond to everyone.
I think that is my strategy is pretty simple. I do have, I guess you call it a strategy, and anyone that's listening, you can start enacting this. And it's I try to interact with everybody, but there's some places that I just can't keep up with. But the first thing I always say when I hear from someone is thank you, and then I kind of, if it's just a comment, I'll say, thanks, and maybe comment on their comment. If it's a question, I'll answer their question. And then I usually always ask them how they found out about the podcast. And like 90% of the time, that leads me to another person that I can say thank you to. Like, oh, I heard about it from this person. Or, oh, I heard about it from this. Or, oh, someone posted on their blog. And then you can go there and thank that person. And that's really my strategy. And it really has worked well. It kind of builds a community, and it builds appreciation and gratitude for me to know that, oh, when I'm recording the podcast, I can look back at my interactions with the listeners and know, okay, these are real people listening to the show. And anytime I feel down or, tired or, oh, I don't want to record today, I got too, I can say, oh, okay, well, let me think about this person that's having trouble sleeping, just like I had trouble sleeping as a little kid. And it helps keep me going.
Yeah, you make it sound so cool, man. You're just like chilling, just like, yeah, man, it's good, but I'm sure it takes hours. You know what I mean? You're writing stories, right? And you're I don't know, you have all this other stuff you're publishing on, Facebook, and I know you got a pretty active Patreon you're trying to build up, and I don't know, I guess how long is this taking you to put out one episode?
Yeah, it takes a lot. I put out 3 episodes a week, and I don't recommend that for anybody. And for every hour of content, I probably spend 20 hours of work. Wow. So it's a lot of work. And even now, I've been doing the show 4 years, and I'm still trying to wonder, am I overworking? Is this sustainable? Should I go to 2 episodes a month or 2 episodes a week? But I think the work shows. And not only does the work show in the podcast, but I think when people are thinking about starting out early on or wondering, oh, should I keep going with this podcast? You learn so many intangible skills and actually tangible skills like podcast editing, like being on the mic, public presentation skills. And by making a podcast consistently week after week or every other week or once a month, you're getting all these other benefits, because when you have a job and stuff and you get used to it, you might stop learning or stop developing your skills, or maybe you fall into a groove. And a podcast kind of almost keeps you outside of your comfort zone and outside of your groove all the time, because there's so many different things to adjust to and learn, and the industry's kind of changing all the time. So it's there's a lot of other benefits other than that you can get out of it for your personal development, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, it's funny you say it, because it's weird, because you're kind of going against the norm, right? And what I mean is about your speech. You kind of speak in a way where people would, especially I'm a podcast producer myself. So coming from that world, a lot of my peers are saying oh my God, ums and ahs and the uhs, I guess, do people give you a lot of bad feedback? I think it's cool because it's super natural and authentic, and I can relate to it, right? But I'm sure do people give you negative flack or for it or anything like that, or no?
Yeah, there are, no matter what you do and you put it out publicly on the internet, you're going to get some negative feedback. And I think that's just another benefit, is to say, to be able to get criticism and try to determine, is this criticism just somebody that has to unload on me, or is this an authentic piece of criticism, constructive? So when I get feedback about my speech patterns or the imperfections in the show, I try to be okay, is this something that's distracting the listener from the experience of falling asleep? Or is this a listener, or not even a listener, a casual listener, a person that just tuned in once or twice, and they just chose me to unload on? And that's not always easy to determine, but I think it helps you get used to getting feedback. And I don't know, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and so sometimes I do man, am I gonna like I stutter a lot, or I use a lot of pauses, or I get overexcited. And I think there's always room for improvement, even in my show. Like right now I have 3 words up on my my stand of like trying to say less knows and likes and stuff. But I think there is like a matter of like my show is like easy and meandering. But when you start to listen to a lot of podcasts, like even as a podcast producer, you learn that there's like a difference between like what's distracting the audience and what's like just a person confidently expressing themselves. And so like speech patterns that are from insecurity or doubt, I think are more distracting than a person that's just confident. I mean, you've probably listened to tons of podcasts, maybe that you don't even produce, that could be super popular and their audio quality isn't that great because either the content, and that's a rare thing, but like there's some shows that'll just come out of nowhere and they don't have that good of audio quality or even speech quality, but either the person is a personality or they're talking about something that's super gripping. So I think it's like more a matter of getting comfortable and having some self-confidence and having the ability to keep developing and keep changing it and accepting that you're not perfect, but that you can get a little bit better.
Yeah. Do you edit your own show or did you in the beginning when you first started?
Yeah, so I edited my own shows 3 times a week, like at like 2 a.m. or at lunch at work and stuff, for like 2.5 years, maybe 3 years. And then it got to the point where I couldn't keep up anymore. And I was literally in a position where I was like, I'll either have to find an editor or cut back on the show or not sleep at all. And I was like, I can't make a sleep podcast if I'm not sleeping at all. So then I started working with editors, but I still listen. Like I'll record, I'll send the stuff out to the editor, and then they'll send me back, and then I'll listen and I do the final mix still. So I'm still listening to the show. And I think that's a huge, even if you don't edit your show, hearing yourself really helps like reinforce some of those things. I'm sure as an editor, you must learn a ton because you're listening to not only to your own show, but to all these other shows.
Yeah, I do learn a lot, but I've become a bit more, well, I even got better myself, right, over time, but I mean, better is subjective. I feel more comfortable, I guess, at the end of the day, you know what I mean? But I also think that people get super stressed because you mentioned, you put a lot of time in your show and, some people want it perfection, or maybe it's over perfection. I don't know. I mean, like, how'd you break that fear of, because you had the idea to start this show a long time ago, but it took you a while. So like, how'd you overcome that little fear barrier of actually doing it and saying, you know what, I'm comfortable with how I talk and what idea I have, and I'm ready to go after it?
Whew, that's a great question. I mean, that's a really tough thing. And I think I had trouble with it. Like I literally put my show off for years and years and years because of that. Like I said, oh, this idea is too silly. It's too goofy. It's too strange. And there was even one point where I was like really close to starting the show and I still put it off for another year. And I think the way I finally got over the fear was like really looking at it like fear versus regret. And it was like, if I look back on things, am I going to regret more starting the podcast or being afraid to start it? Or like another way to look at it is like, if I wasn't afraid of being embarrassed or whatever the fears you might have of starting a show or not being super successful, if I wasn't afraid, how would I choose? If there was no fear at all, what decision would I make? And then I also knew there's this like little kid part of me, and I don't know if everybody has that, like a little kid like sidekick, walking at your side, making goofy jokes and stuff, from your childhood. But I had that little kid who was like, come on, let's start this podcast, man. It's going to be fun. Like, let's do it. And like looking at it, like giving that kid a gift and saying, here, you know what? I know I take tons of stuff way too seriously, but let me give you this gift and let's try to make this podcast and just see how it goes and see what comes out of it. And like having those expectations of like, hey, let's do this as an experiment. But I guess also accepting that there's going to be a critical part of you that has unrealistic expectations that everything's going to go bad. And maybe there's going to be another part of you that has unrealistic expectations that, the day your podcast launches, you're going to get like 100,000 downloads. And those are natural expectations. They might be unrealistic, but most people have them. And it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you because you think your show's going to be super successful right away. Everybody does, and everybody wishes, just like everybody wants to win the lottery. It's like a natural, it's a natural thing to want. It's just being ready for when that doesn't happen and to keep going.
do you still work another job and work on the show at the same time?
Yeah, so I've been working, like I'm just about to try to figure out a way to transition out of my job. But yeah, I've been working the whole time and like trying to just manage my time and like work on the weekends on the podcast or work at night or work early in the mornings. And I've kind of set a 4-year limit to kind of see, well, geez, like I don't know if it's not really manageable, but I think like having a more realistic release schedule of like one episode a week or one episode every 2 weeks is way more realistic. It was just for me with a sleep podcast, I kind of had my goals of like, oh, if someone's going to rely on this podcast to put them to sleep, they're going to want it more than one day a week. So it was just kind of part of my, I guess, vision for the podcast.
Yeah, so I guess because I think people struggle with the balance between, business to make their podcast a business or a hobby. And, when you're not earning money and you're putting 20, 40, 60 hours a week in your show, I mean, that must be hard to kind of push through and to do 2 jobs at once. I think a lot of people can relate to that. I don't know if you have like any, golden tip to give someone besides work your ass off. I don't know.
I mean, I think like, again, maybe looking at it like as a chance for an experiment or a chance for like getting to know yourself, like I found really powerful is like using like a timer and like paying attention to like 30 minutes or 25-minute, like what tasks you can get done in that time, but also paying attention to like other times. Like if you're writing for a podcast episode or doing research or something, like 25 minutes can seem like 6 hours. But if you're on the internet, like I know on my phone, I'll wake up and sometimes I'll be like, oh, let me just check out what's going on Twitter or Facebook. And if you pay attention to that time, it's like, even now I still fall into that trap. And it's like, wait, 40 minutes just went by? Like, holy cow. Like, so it's just like looking at like what time you can recover and be like, oh, this is my time. Like, I want it back. I don't want to be distracted. Like, maybe you have to like watch less TV or get up an hour earlier. But I guess like looking back at like the gift to the little kid and being like, if this is important to you, maybe it's important to me. I want to do this for you. So I'm going to try to scrape out whatever 4 or 5 hours a week at first, just to see, like, get started with the podcast and see how it goes.
I guess maybe when you first started, you didn't, but I assume now your show makes money somehow.
Yeah. I mean, so let's see, I have Patreon. We have like affiliate deals with some companies. We have some sponsorships. So I've kind of tried like a little bit of everything. And I always tell people like, starting with like affiliate deals is like a great way to go, like, because then you can really see how engaged your audience is and really get used to like testing stuff out and kind of seeing like, oh, am I comfortable with, is my audience comfortable with doing ad reads and kind of see how it works.
Did the sponsors come to you, or that was kind of something? Because some people, sometimes once you get good downloads, you make a name for yourself. You know what I mean? Some people are like, well, how do I get sponsors? How do I make money? You know what I mean? What step did you take? Yeah,
so I definitely waited. Like I had heard like people throw out different numbers. Like I think Rob from Libsyn, I can't remember what their current, when they start looking for sponsorship shows. But if you listen to a lot of podcasts about podcasting, there's like numbers out there. So I waited till I had some numbers in that range. And like right around that time, I had heard from some people. And at first, it still couldn't like make a deal. Like it'd be like, oh, well, maybe we want to sponsor your show, but just for exposure. And I'm like, no, like I don't want to just do it, that you're going to talk about my podcast on your mailing list. So it's kind of being patient. And then I think I started with the Amazon affiliate program before I had any sponsors. And then it was a matter of like some sponsors reaching out to me and then cold calling. Me and a friend like did a lot of cold emailing and like hustling, I guess, to try to find companies to work with. How'd you get the I don't remember the name. I'm sorry. What's the sleep headphones? Oh, sleep phones. Yeah. They're great. Like they've been our like longest like sponsor. And, to be honest, like I think I had researched them and they had researched me. And at some point, like they had reached out to me, but I was already aware of them because I was like, oh, this is a perfect product for my listeners. And then it was just, and they're like they're in Erie, Pennsylvania, so it's a small family business, and yeah, it's just a good connection.
It's so cool. Yeah, because I think sometimes, because you said, people sometimes get sponsorships and it doesn't relate to their show, or it feels maybe uncomfortable because you're trying to stay like authentic and organic. So when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's perfect, man. That's such a cool, little nifty product to kind of get going. And so you have you talked about Patreon, man. I know so many people that are struggling with Patreon because they kind of just, I don't know, what do most people do? I mean, I guess why do people decide to become a Patreon with you and your show? What does Patreon offer for you?
I mean, I think like deciding when to start your Patreon, I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong time, but I've heard like Jonathan Oakes, who has a Trivial Warfare podcast, like he gave a presentation at Podcast Movement about it. And it's kind of like, one thing is to like wait until people, more than one listener is like, hey, how can I support your show? Like that's a good sign to like start a Patreon. And I think it's like, goes back to kind of what we're talking about how you speak on your podcast. And like, because I've listened to your show and it's like, you definitely sound authentic and like you're being yourself instead of like trying to be super like a perfect, like, hello, this is Anthony. Welcome to the Podcast Ninja podcast. And I think like being yourself is the same thing with Patreon. Like it's like if you're like, hey, I know you enjoy the show, I know you get a benefit out of it, I'd love it if you think about supporting it, like because a lot of work goes into the show, or however you do your pitch. But it's like, hey, I'm giving value to you, would you like to give value back? It's voluntary. And I mean, I do have rewards like ad-free episodes and story-only episodes, but I try to focus it on, this is kind of like how the internet works now, like especially for independent artists, is like if you want the show to be out here in the world, like a certain small percentage of you can support it for all the other people and keep it free. So it's kind of like it can be a beautiful thing. Like if people are willing to support something that's free, it can stay free, and the artist can eventually make a living doing it.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty, right? Getting paid for what we love to do. I mean, that's something I strive for too. I know you said you're trying to also convert from your job to making this a full-time. Do you have, I mean, you don't have to share it obviously, but any like kind of long-term strategy, revenue earning strategy to try to fully compensate to kind of finally live off of your true passion,
Yeah, I'm kind of struggling with that right now because I'm at like a decision point, like where it's like, I'd like to develop like a live version of the podcast, but I don't view that as like podcast income. Like it would be like another job. So it's like, should I cut back on the podcast and work on a live version of the podcast? And that would be speculative because it's like, I don't know if the live version of the podcast would be something that would be break even or would make money. And then, as you know, with podcast advertising, it's like right now, it's like unpredictable. So it's like I don't want to ever count on any sponsorship money to live on just because I have a daughter and it just seems like a little bit risky. I mean, maybe 2 or 3 years from now, like the podcast industry will be kind of settled. But so I don't know. I'm looking for other opportunities and just trying to keep my listeners involved. But I think it's a matter of like staying patient and kind of seeing it as a thing. And then maybe developing, I don't know, like right now I'm so busy, but it'd be like, okay, should I develop another podcast that's not related to sleep? Or should I try to develop the intellectual property behind my podcast, like, and pitch it in some other medium? Or should I just try to get freelance work, like not as a podcast producer, but like helping out on other podcasts or stuff like that? So it's, it can be a little bit scary, but I guess it's like a luxury problem. It's like, wow, like as we said when we started this interview, it's like if I was a kid and I knew this was going to be the risks I was going to be taking, I'd be like, okay, this is a good thing to be scared about, instead of like being scared as I was years ago of like, oh, I just don't want to start that podcast because people are going to make fun of me and laugh at it and think it's a stupid idea. It's like, oh, okay, now I'm more scared of like, I have this thing, I have this audience, how am I going to keep it going?
Yeah. Wait, don't you have like some sort of writing background or something like that, or no? I don't know why I thought that.
Yeah, I've been writing for like not paid though. So also like I was writing for a while before I started the podcast, and then I was like writing some YouTube stuff that never got. That was actually what led to the podcast. Like I was writing a YouTube series with 2 other people, and similar to the podcast, we were having like a failure to launch. We were like, okay, when are we going to film this and start releasing it? And we couldn't agree. And I said, listen, if we're not going to start releasing this, I can't keep working on it, because I'd listened to enough podcasts to know it's like there's no better time to start than right now, because like it's really like for independent podcasters, I really think it takes a few years to not only get used to doing a podcast, but to really develop a relationship with your audience, because it's not just about the audience growth. It's like about the relationship with them. I think about like the podcast My Brother and Me. I don't know if you listen to that at all, but it's like these three brothers, and it's a comedy podcast, and it's been around for a while, and they've been around, and you can just tell the relationship they've had with their audience has been built up over years. And I think like stuff like that takes time, like just like any other relationship in your life.
You're talking about, it's no better time than now to launch a podcast, but I know some people feel kind of pressured, by the competition. Not everyone has a unique idea like yours, where maybe the market for their brand or their idea is oversaturated. I mean, even just Googling, I was just trying to find the podcasts, but I can't find it right now. But I know you have like a couple that are slowly coming up that help you sleep. But I mean, I don't think they're as good as yours, but I guess how would you help deal with competition and things like this? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is like an interesting time to develop a podcast, and maybe it's a good thing. You really, if you're going to start a podcast and you want to build an audience, there's no reason to not do it because of doubt. But I think there's also, you shouldn't be overconfident. Like, you should really distill down your concept. Like, some people talk about niche or niching and niching down. I think it's more about like, what unique voice do you bring? And what unique twist? Like, there's a podcast called Doughboys that I listen to, and it's two comedians talking about chain restaurants with another comedian. They eat at a chain restaurant, and then they talk about it. But really, that's just the conceit. Like, really, it's just three people having a really funny conversation. So, like, having something that the audience can enter into, like Podcast Ninja is a really good title. Like, it's self-explanatory. Like, and that's kind of what I mean. Like when someone sees the artwork, when they read the title of the podcast, they already know kind of what it's about, and it kind of stirs something in them. Like, oh, well, this is probably going to be a little bit different twist of the podcast, like than like another show. So why don't I try that? Or, oh, I already like School of Podcasting, or some of the like Audacity podcasts, like some guests you've had on. So it's clear, like there's like this idea of the rising tide lifting all boats. And I think like having the confidence to be like, okay, I have a unique enough voice. Or by starting your podcast and doing it for 6 months, you realize, oh, well, this isn't working. Maybe I need to change this. Or, people say, oh, maybe I need to pivot. Maybe instead of talking about fishing lures, I need to talk about just northern fly fishing lures. And then suddenly your podcast will, it's like, well, that's really what I'm passionate about, is like the different colors of feathers used in fishing lures. And then your podcast will find an audience. It might not be huge, but it's like going to be people that share what you're interested in.
Yeah, I think people have a hard time with niche and stuff like that. I think that's good. I think that I'm curious to know what, like, there had to have been a moment where you're just like, listen, man, like, I don't know, I might give this up, or like, this is really too hard for me. I don't know, maybe I need help. Did you have like a moment like that?
I have a moment like that every 3 days, I think, to be like for sure. Like, yeah, it's tough making a podcast, and I think it like is expanding, and I have a really big self-critic. So like, I think it really becomes like a chance to like learn resilience. Like, everybody talks about brain plasticity and resiliency, and to really see it as a chance to keep going. And like, I set points like at meetings with my self-critic. So if you make a podcast by yourself, maybe you just set a meeting with your self-critic or whatever parts you are struggling. Or if you make a show with co-hosts or other people, like set a meeting like every 4 months or something, and decide then like, okay, should we keep the podcast going for 4 more months, or should we stop? And I'd done that. Like, my goal when I started the podcast was to make it to 2 episodes. And I was like, I'm not quitting until I make 2 episodes and put them out. And then at 2 episodes, I was like, should I keep going? Yeah, let's keep going. Let's make 10 episodes. At 10 episodes, I was like, let's keep going to make 50. So between 10 and 50, every time I wanted to quit, I was like, okay, once we get to episode 50, we'll decide if we're going to quit or not. And then by the time I got to episode 50, I was like, no, let's keep going and see if we can do this for a year. So having places where you can say it's okay to quit, I think are good. It's like maybe being more specific about it so that you're not constantly, because I mean, I still constantly think about it. It's like 11 o'clock at night and I'm like, okay, I still got to record an opening or something. And I'm like, oh man, what am I doing? Like, but it's like, I think another thing is like thinking about that one person that's listening and picture their earbuds in their ear and that they've allowed you to be that close to their brain, that they've taken the time to download your podcast and listen to it. And I don't know, that there's this closeness there, and it's like, okay, yeah, I want to make it. I'll sit down and do the work tonight. And I know we're stressed, and I know this is kind of overwhelming. So let's see at episode 100 if we should stop. But by the time you get to that quit point, it's usually like, no, let's keep going. Let's just see how this goes for another 50 episodes.
I remember, when I first started online blogging or YouTube videos, or even this, starting this show, I was so excited when one of my family members listened to the show. You know what I mean? Like I always say, like there's always your mom, or she'll always give you the thumbs up on Facebook, and that was my original boost. Does your family listen to the show, or?
What's funny is they like. At first, like people would listen, like because they'd be like, because the uniqueness. Oh, you have a podcast? Let me listen to it. And then they'd be like, well, I don't know if I could fall asleep to you. It's kind of like you kind of said, you're kind of goofy and you do a lot of goofing around. But as different people, like one of my brothers, he's a school teacher in Philly, and his school year just started, and he was having trouble sleeping because back to school, change in schedule. And he started listening to podcasts, and it put him to sleep. And he was like, wow, he goes, this thing really works. So that's always a boost. It's like when people listen to your show and they're like, wow, I actually it worked. It's like, okay, that's a big thumbs up, like you said, like from your mom.
It's crazy, man. So do people come up to you when you're walking in the streets? I know that sounds crazy, but come on, no, does anyone recognize you, or at least your voice?
I never had that experience till maybe 4 months ago. I was on a plane, and I love plane trips because you don't have the internet and you don't have a lot of distractions. So I could bang out all these old editing jobs or trying to fix something for 6. This was a 6-hour flight. So I'm like, man, I'm going to bang out 6 hours of editing, no problem. So whole flight, I'm doing all this editing and doing this tweaking. And this guy's sitting next to me, and every once in a while he'd look over. And, audio editors look kind of strange. So I was like, oh, okay, maybe he's going to ask me some questions about the audio editor. And at the end of the flight, I have a sticker for my podcast on my laptop, and he goes, do you make the Sleep With Me podcast? Or are you Scooter? That's the name I use for the podcast. And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, oh, man. He goes, I had a really bad breakup with my girlfriend a couple months ago, and I've been listening to podcasts to sleep. And it was it was just so touching. So I got recognized more for my sticker than my voice, though, but it was pretty cool.
Dude, that's fun. Do you have a t-shirt or anything? Do you advertise one by one? You ever do that? Where it's a sticker or a t-shirt, or just say, hey, do you introduce yourself and say hey, I host a podcast?
I've been doing, let's see, I had from Podcast Movement this ask me about my podcast button, and this was pretty cool. I was waiting in line for something the other day, and somebody behind me was like, hey, I got to ask you about your podcast, because it says ask you about your podcast. And I was like, oh, yeah, sure. Do you listen to podcasts? And it started that conversation that a lot of podcasters love people to have, which is no, I don't really listen to any podcasts. And I was like, oh, okay, what are you interested in? And then the person in front of us in line started getting my back. He's like, oh, man, yeah, you should listen to S-Town and this. And then the guy in front of me in line was he kept talking about podcasts. So we were getting this guy. We're like, get out your phone, man. Let's get you subscribed to some podcasts. And then ended up the guy in front of me in line was had just gotten into med school, and he was listening. He was a listener of one of my friends that I'd just seen, Ryan Gray. He has a podcast, The Pre-Med Years. And he was an avid listener of that podcast. So I was like, holy cow, I know the guy that makes that podcast. That's so cool. What a small world.
Crazy, man. The community is so niche sometimes, but people are diehard, man. Super passionate. I think it's cool.
Yeah.
I think people are really going to love this episode, I mean, we kind of I feel like we could just talk back and forth just about things, but I want to keep it practical for everyone. So I think it's great, man. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I want if people want to get on that commentary and tell you how much they love the show, I'm sure they know how to reach out, right? sleepwithmepodcast.com. Is that the best way? You're pretty reachable via email too, which was really cool. I was really happy to have you respond so quickly and come on the show,
Yeah, thanks for reaching out. Like Sleep With Me Podcast, or if you just want to listen, you could go to sleepwithmepodcast.com/listen, or on Twitter @DearScooter, or wherever else you find me. And I appreciate you having me on the show. I love talking about podcasts and encouraging people. If you're listening and you're getting ready to start your podcast, or you're wondering if you should keep going, you should. Just go for it. Just do it, man. And it's way easier. I can't tell you if you're an established podcaster how nice it is to have someone like Anthony that you can rely on, like a podcast producer, podcast editor. Like, it makes your life so much easier.
Yeah, it's true. Thanks, man. I really appreciate it, man. Thanks for coming on. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Anthony. Have a great one.
Thank you for listening to the 11th episode of Podcast Ninja. If you want to check out Drew's podcast, or you want to check out some of the shows that he talked about during the show, just go ahead and go to podcastninja.net/11, and I'll talk to you soon.
Podcast Ninja.